But without that in-depth study that we do, I really feel like the patients are better off having PAs look at those cases so that we can make sure we get those very critical sections. Because sometimes it's not just looking at that there's the mass. We can see that there's a mass. Anyone can tell that there's a mass. Being able to tell that it invaded from layer 1 to layer 2 to layer 3, or all the way out of all the layers, that's one of the critical decisions. And if you don't have that education, that's going to be a really hard call to make. That can completely change the stage of the cancer for the patient, for better or worse. If you undercall it, they're not going to get enough treatment. If you overcall it, they get too much treatment. And neither of those is good for the patient.
Welcome to the People of Pathology podcast. I'm Dennis Strank. On this podcast, we explore pathology one story at a time and connect with the people behind the diagnosis. Today, we're looking at licensure for Pathologist Assistants. Joining me are Jennifer Hudson and Ashley Olson from the AAPA Legislative Subcommittee. Many of us have heard of ASCP certification, but licensure is something different. It's a formal state-level process that verifies credentials and protects the profession. We'll explore what licensure actually means, how it benefits both PAs and patients, and why it matters now more than ever. All right, let's get into it with Jennifer Hudson and Ashley Olson. We're going to be talking about licensure for pathologist assistants, which is a pretty hot topic, I guess we can call it. So Jennifer, we're going to start with you. And so let's define, I guess, what we're talking about. So what does licensure mean for pathologist assistants? And then from there, let's talk about how is it different from ASCP certification?
Sure, no problem. So I wanted to start with ASCP certification because that's probably the best known pathway out there. Certification is proof that you participated in a particular education program and completed the training associated with that program. And in order to be certified as a PA, someone would have to attend the accredited PA program out there, or one of the many programs out there, and successfully graduate from that program. Once you've graduated, the next step would be that you become eligible for taking the ASCP Board of Certification exam. If you pass the exam with a good score, then you have officially earned your certification, designating you as a pathologist assistant, which is wonderful and glad to have it. And many facilities do use the certification as a job requirement, but many of them do not. With licensure, that is the way where employers can verify that you actually have the credentials that a PA certification that you claim to have on a resume. So during the application process in states with licensure, a state board of peers, such as other laboratory professionals or pathologists, get together and they review your licensure application, which is essentially the same thing that you would submit to your HR department if you're applying for a new job. So things like your resume, your school transcripts, your passing exam score, all of that to show that you're certified. And the board of peers then reviews that application to make sure that everything makes sense and is accurate and that you're not just trying to produce some sort of made up credentials, because believe it or not, it does. So the bonus to this is you have people in the profession or in adjacent professions reviewing it so they're knowledgeable about the field themselves and they have a better idea of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. By doing this, HR then doesn't have to do that verification themselves. When HR goes to review your application for a job, they would go to the credentialing board website. They can type in your name, do a quick search for you, and that website will show your license number, which is an easy way for the employer to say, yep, they have everything they're supposed to have. State board says they're qualified. And it makes it a lot easier for HR because they don't know the profession, especially pathology, especially anatomic pathology, and even more, I feel like, with PAs because we're a newer profession.
Yeah.
So it takes that pressure off of the HR representatives to make decisions that they may otherwise not be qualified to decide. So without licensure, they do that, and it's maybe not always the best response or best decision, but they don't know what they don't. So that's one of the best ways to explain the difference between licensure and certification.
Okay, that makes sense. So Ashley, over to you now. Why is licensure necessary now, especially given that our role as pathologist assistants is evolving a bit? So can we talk about this? Why is it the time to start looking at licensure?
Definitely. So, of course, this profession is always growing and changing. That's just the nature of medicine. As far as our profession in particular, there have been some recent studies that have estimated that based on the average medical residents electing for a career in pathology compared to the retirement and attrition rates of current pathologist populations, there could be as much as a 30% decrease in pathologists within the next 5 years. Additionally, pathology is becoming more geared toward individualized medicine with new staining, molecular and genetic technologies, and pathologists are now performing more detailed and specialized testing to allow patients to receive treatments that are most effective for their genetic variations or mutations, significantly increasing the pathologist's workload over the past 10 years. The pathologist assistants profession was designed to alleviate certain aspects of the pathologist's workload to include things like gross examination, which was historically performed by pathologists and residents, but is now largely performed by PAs and other grossing personnel. This has freed up the pathologist to focus their efforts on the interpretation of the microscopic slides, special studies, and creating the detailed final pathology reports, allowing clinical providers to select appropriate treatments and even clinical trials. Pathologist assistants will be vital to daily medical operations as pathologist shortages continue to increase. Since we are taking over work that used to be performed by pathologists, we attend accredited programs and sit for a board of certification exam. And the next logical step is to pursue licensure, ensuring that someone calling themselves a PA has the necessary training and education to support the roles previously handled by pathologists.
So it sounds like a lot of the reason for pursuing licensure then, like you're saying, ensures a competence for the people that are doing the grossing. So that's us. Well, let's talk about this. Like, how does this ensure competence? And as far as patient safety, it ensures or improves patient safety in the pathology lab. How does licensure accomplish that?
Definitely. So this licensure will help ensure patient safety in the simple basis that all of this verification is going into making sure that the people who are handling your specimens are actually qualified to do so. So that licensure is just an extra layer of protection to make sure that the PAs who are handling those large complex cancer resections actually know what they're looking at and taking the proper sections to make sure that the proper diagnosis is made at the end of the day.
It sounds very important. Obviously, I think from the point of view of the patient, I suppose they don't really know about us very much, but
Right.
they would want the people that are examining their specimen, like you're saying, they'd want that person to be competent. So this makes a lot of
Mhm.
sense.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And I can just add to that myself. I've personally experienced times when I've handled pieces that were meant to be or could have been handled in another facility by, say, a grossing tech. And it was for, say, a gallbladder. Gallbladders are considered routine or standard specimens. And a lot of times they're considered quote unquote junk cases because they're so routine, they're so normal for inflammation, etc. But many times I've found incidental cancers simply because I know exactly what I'm looking at. I understand what I'm seeing and the pathological diseases that could be there. Whereas the grossing tech may have looked at that maybe slightly weird area and been like, well, I don't know how to describe that. So I'm just going to ignore it.
Right.
Um, and now that patient's diagnosis is now considered benign, but in actuality, it was potentially cancerous.
I definitely agree.
Yeah. So that's a lot of the point, right? This licensure ensures that the people that are looking at these specimens know what they're looking for, and
Absolutely.
they understand what's there and what isn't there.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Now you mentioned grossing techs, and I want to talk about grossing technicians and as well as histotechnologists. How does licensure distinguish the role of the PA from grossing techs and histotechs?
So the PA title is often confused with other lab professions, such as a pathology assistant who helps with accessioning or casework.
Right.
Also can be known as a lab aide or an accessioner in other facilities, or a pathologist assistant who is really just a pathology secretary. So it's just a little misnomer there. And Jen actually has an example of when they've tried to recruit for a PA in the past, and they had somebody applying thinking that they were just going to be typing reports or assisting the pathologist with some paperwork instead of actually working in the lab grossing things. And another example is that some commercial labs have different tiers of PAs based on whether or not they're certified. And then I think I've also seen other labs have other tiers and they're not necessarily calling them PAs, but like grossing tech, biopsy tech, things like that. But sometimes they can tend to also call those people PAs, even though they're not fully certified like what we do. The licensure would define what a pathologist assistant is to include a scope of practice, their education requirements, as we talked about earlier, and a statewide recognized title. PA license doesn't prevent grossing techs from doing their work at all. It simply prevents its employers from inappropriately titling staff as uncertified PA. Based on ASAP requirements, you are either a certified PA or you are not a PA. However, without a license, there is nothing preventing the misuse of the title or misleading job postings. To summarize all that, licensure is just a way of differentiating ourselves as PAs from grossing techs or histotechs or anything like that.
Because theoretically, each of those positions, a grossing tech could be doing small biopsies, a PA could be doing the complex cases, a histotech is doing the microtomy, the staining,
Mhm.
the embedding. So they're all very different roles. So I think it's really important, and licensure is a good way to accomplish this, just to change up and define those roles so that we each have a very distinct place in the lab.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess kind of indirectly, it would define the role of at least the grossing tech in a way.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you know this, but the types of specimens that a grossing tech can gross, is that defined? Do we know?
So legally, the answer is no. All grossing is considered high complexity testing according to CLIA. AAPA has a position statement that explains our recommendations for what a grossing tech should do as opposed to what a PA should do, but it's just that, a recommendation. Most facilities kind of draw their own line in the sand. Some places follow more of AAPA standard, which is entirely submitted tissues that do not require dissection. So things like GI biopsies and core biopsies and things like that. Other places may train their grossing tech to go up a little bit higher in complexity to do things like benign uteruses, gallbladders, things of that nature. So currently, legally, is there a definition? No. And I think that definition would still be able to be made by the facilities if licensure is only created for PAs. But at least we could distinguish that a PA can do everything. And then the facility could set their standards, or the state could set their standards for the grossing tests.
That's interesting. Like this is getting off topic, but I wonder if kind of widespread licensure of PAs would help to force the issue of defining the role of the grossing tech a little bit more. Whether
I would definitely think so.
yeah,
Yeah, I
Yeah,
feel
me
like
too.
going down the path of defining the role of a PA would definitely help lend ourselves to helping define the roles of the other people who are doing this work, like the grossing techs and even biopsy techs.
sure.
Yeah, and I've seen that in larger facilities, they have a pretty good idea and a pretty well defined pathway for where those specimens are going. Like they have their own set biopsy techs, their own set grossing techs, and their own set PAs. But I think where these licensures are really going to help are in those smaller environments and private pathology labs and smaller community hospitals where you have a lot of people wearing a lot of different hats. And of course, at sometimes it's just it is what it is when you're in a real setting and you only have a few people there. But at the same time, we need to be able to protect not only our profession, but also, who is handling what specimen. And I think this would help overall for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
The last few episodes I've done that had pathology as a more patient facing specialty, that was kind of the theme of them. And the one previous to this was actually a patient advocate, and she had gone through her own cancer treatment. And I remember she said that the PAs that worked on her specimen saved her life, right? Which was very kind of moving for me. And I've had family members that have had the same kind of experience. So I wonder then, can we talk about more like how licensure would benefit the patients, especially talking about like high complexity cancer resections?
Absolutely. So kind of like we've been talking about a little bit previously, the biggest benefit for the patients as it relates to the PA licensure is that you're making sure that each patient is getting the highest quality care, especially with the highest complexity specimens, such as those cancer resections. And it makes sure that the pathology staff handling those complex cases are qualified and they know what they're looking at. They can safely and accurately handle even those little abnormalities, like I was referencing earlier about the gallbladder. It can be a slight little raised bump in the mucosal surface, and we would call it out as a TA that this is a little bit weird, only give you a section. Maybe it's nothing, but better to be safe. Whereas the nursing tech might be a little bit afraid of how to describe that and maybe avoid that. So these subtle differences can be really hard to detect if you don't have that PA background and training. So since the nursing tech backgrounds can be highly variable, I mean, they could come from many lines of work. I've seen them as cytotox, histotox. I've seen med techs. And so those are all very different educational backgrounds. And that's not to say that people can't learn, but without that in-depth study that we do, I really feel like the patients are better off having PAs look at those cases so that we can make sure we get those very critical sections. Because sometimes it's not just looking at that there's the mass. We can see that there's a mass. Anyone can tell that there's a mass. Being able to tell that it invaded from layer 1 to layer 2 to layer 3, or all the way out of all the layers, that's one of the critical decisions. And if you don't have that education, that's going to be a really hard call to make. That can completely change the stage of the cancer for the patient, for better or worse. If you undercall it, they're not going to get enough treatment. If you overcall it, they get too much treatment. And neither of those is good for the patient. So we want to make sure that they get that high quality care that we've come to expect from our healthcare systems.
I think another note to add on to that, or at least another example of why it's so important to have somebody who's professionally trained looking at these specimens, is colon cancers and lymph node searches, or any other regional lymph node dissection that's happening, identifying all of those teeny tiny lymph nodes. That is such a huge part of what we do. And I remember when I was in PA clinicals, man, I had the hardest time learning how to
Yes.
find lymph nodes at
Yes.
first. Oh my gosh, it takes years and a lot of practice to really learn how to find all of those little nodes that you really need to find, because I've heard so many cases of PAs having their pathologist come back saying, you submitted 60 lymph nodes on this total colon and 2 of them were positive. If you hadn't found those 2 positive nodes in all of those lymph nodes, then the treatment would have been different. And there's case after case after case like that. And it's because people know what they're looking for those things.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and even as a PA student, right? I know, especially as a student, I struggle to find those nodes, especially those tiny ones, right? It's easy to find the
Mhm.
big ones, but those little ones can be just as important. And with another PA coming back over, I'm like, feel this one here, feel that there. There's a tiny one right there. And so just that like in-depth, hands-on, one-on-one training that we get through our program is so critical to being able to make a difference in a patient outcome.
Definitely.
Yeah, those are really great examples. I mean, we are literally, like I mentioned from the previous podcast episode, we are literally saving lives at times. And it's interesting too. We have residents where I work, and so we sometimes teach them. And when they're showing them how to search for lymph nodes for the first time, and I always say this is a skill that you have to learn. Like you have to train your hands, your fingers to do this, and so take the time to do it, because you don't learn that overnight. It takes training and education to do it. So
Mhm.
it's good examples.
Agreed. Agreed.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Okay. So we've been talking about benefits of licensure, both for PAs and for patients. And I know there are some misconceptions out there about licensure. And so let's talk about some of those. I know one of them is it's unnecessary bureaucracy. It's just the government trying to get more money, things like that. But let's talk about some of these and kind of dispel them, I guess.
Sure. So I guess the first one I'll talk about is something that we found out a little bit more recently, but some pathologists think that we already have licensure because we're considered the other PAs, right? So we're akin to physician assistants, and pathologists think that we are licensed. They have no idea that licensure doesn't already exist because they just see us as physician assistants. So right there off the bat, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a misconception. And so we don't have anyone advocating for us because pathologists, at least some of them, feel or think they know that we have licensure already. We actually don't, which was an interesting thing that I found out pretty recently. So that's partly why we want to do a lot of education, both of the PA community and pathologists, and even other laboratory professionals out there. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, how did you find that out?
Yeah. I don't think I've ever heard that. That's crazy.
Actually, just from talking to pathologists and other PAs that have good relationships with their pathologists, I've asked some of them to put out some feelers and see what they think about PA licensure. And they're like, oh, you already have it. It's great that you have it. And the answer was just, well, actually, we don't.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was an interesting thing to come across. So we've been putting a lot of effort into education. Another misconception is that some pathologists think that if we become licensed, we're going to try to take more of their work from them and encroach on their job and try to take over their space.
Okay.
But federally in CLIA, we are not qualified to do the pathologist diagnoses, right? That's not what we're trained to do. We're trained to do the grossing, the dissection, the visual identification of the tumors and the diseases. But the meat and potatoes work for the pathologist is going to be their case sign out, looking under that scope, looking at those stains and those genetic sequencings and looking at the moleculars and figuring out, what do I have in front of me? That part we're never going to touch. That's theirs and theirs alone. And that's becoming a more and more time consuming process for them. So we want to make sure that the pathologists are aware we're not coming in to step on their toes. Another one to talk about is that PAs have their own misconceptions. A lot of PAs believe that if they need to apply for a license, they'll have to take a second licensing exam. And I know that that's extremely nerve-wracking to think about, but when looking through other medical fields like physician assistants, medical technologists, clinical laboratory scientists, histotechnologists, cytotechnologists, that is absolutely not the case. So there's no reason to think that the TA license would be any different. And the reason that's not the case is all of those professions already have their own certifying body. So the state doesn't want to have to put money into developing their own exam. So they're going to take a previously existing board of certification, and they're just going to work with what's already out there. Why reinvent the wheel if it's already been through all the accreditation and the processes to be fully established? So they're going to rely on the examination that's already out there. And that's the same for nurses, all the licensed professions in the medical field that we looked into. There's no secondary exam. Once you pass your cert, you provide all your documents during the license application that you've already done, and they just verify that everything makes sense.
Going back to your point about thinking that this is just bureaucratic red tape, extra
Right.
stuff, in reality, there are actually several examples of why it's important to have this tiny little bit. And really, at the end of the day, it's not that much extra work.
Okay.
I have 2 of the 3 licenses already, and it's really not that bad.
Oh,
So
interesting.
anyway,
Okay.
yeah, which I think we're going to be talking about more, at least at some point, even if it's not part of this, I'll talk about it.
Okay.
But to get back to the bureaucratic side and why it's important still, a couple examples of why. First of all, in the state of Florida, all of the other lab professions out there, like the histotechs, cytotechs, grossing, or not
Medtechs.
grossing, medtechs, there we go. All of those other professions, they are already licensed. They have their own license in Florida, but PAs are the only ones that don't. So because we don't have that license set in Florida, we are actually not eligible for any lab management or supervisor role, because in the state of Florida, in order to be eligible for those management or supervisory positions, you have to be a licensed laboratory professional. So since we're not licensed, we're excluded from that upward growth opportunity. And another example is in Texas, the pathologist assistants are actually being removed from a list of allied health professionals, which further exacerbates our already limited visibility. And the lack of licensure also leaves a gap that allows what we refer to as imposters, people who are not certified PAs, to use our title. And if that imposter creates a negative media or a negative image about our profession or of our profession, then our profession is what actually takes the hit from that, because there's no recourse for the misuse of the unprotected title.
Interesting. This is the People of Pathology podcast with our guests, Jennifer Hudson and Ashley Olson. We'll be right back. Are you thinking about applying to a pathologist assistance program and feeling a little lost? That's why I created the Path to PathA, your PA school application blueprint. This is a step-by-step prep course that gives you everything you need for a strong application. From finding shadowing to writing a standout personal statement to prepping for interviews, this course was made to help you feel informed, confident, and ready. Visit www.thepath2patha.com to join the mailing list. You'll be the first to hear when the course launches. Your path starts here. LabVine is an interactive online learning platform where laboratory professionals learn, develop, and discover by sharing knowledge and building on each other's experience. The platform provides global access to internationally accredited laboratory-specific courses and other resources developed by lab specialists like us for the laboratory industry. LabVine is free to sign up, and you can use the link in the show notes to get started. Now for the rest of my conversation with Ashley Olson and Jennifer Hudson on the People of Pathology podcast. Okay, so let's keep going along this line of thought then, as far as licensure protecting us, the PAs, right? So you've already given a couple examples there. What about things like we talked earlier about how some pathologists think that licensure would enable PAs to kind of encroach on their role? What about licensure protecting us from people encroaching on our role? Job security, right?
Yeah. So, as far as protecting us from other people encroaching on our profession, it really comes down to with us having the protection of a license, it will prevent people who don't have that license or don't have that eligibility to get the license to even be able to apply for the jobs that we should rightfully have. That's really what it comes down to is that license is just another layer of protection of making sure that the people who are applying for the jobs that we should have are actually eligible for them.
And it also starts to like stratify the lab a little bit if you have the
Mm.
license for the PA and a person doesn't meet the requirements for being a licensed PA, they can still fulfill a role in the lab, but not under the PA title. And so when you start to have that distinction between a grossing tech, a biopsy tech, a PA, simply
Right.
because one person meets the qualifications and one doesn't, then you start to do what we call the stratification. So when the stratification occurs, where you have biopsy techs, gross techs, and PAs, those salaries then will start to stratify as well, right? Because right now, gross techs, biopsy techs, PAs, we kind of all get lumped together into one group of grossing personnel. And so the salary for those three different positions could be vastly different. And so a biopsy tech's salary may be falsely inflated because they're being compared to a PA, or vice versa. A PA could be falsely deflated in salary because they're being compared to a biopsy tech. But all of these terms get used interchangeably right now. So the license would help prevent the interchangeability, at least of the PA title, and start to create that distinction in the lab, which should help everybody's salary kind of come to its own tier.
Okay, so it would simplify things in a way.
Yeah.
To expound on that too, or at least to bring another factor into the situation,
Okay.
PAs are not currently defined by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. So when we do those salary range searches, having the average salary of a PA by other similarly titled professions like the grossing tech and biopsy tech and things like that, because they are all grouped into one. So having this license would give another reason for the Bureau of Labor and Statistics to actually clearly define what a pathologist assistant does, and that will in turn create more accurate statistics and therefore more accurate market research studies when it comes to providing equitable salaries based on what we're doing.
Okay. That's definitely a huge benefit for us,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
All right. So the PA profession has kind of I don't know, say it's weird, but interesting. There used to be two ways to get into this field, right? You had the program trained PAs, and then there used to be the on-the-job training, which doesn't exist anymore. That was phased out. But there still are on-the-job trained PAs that are ASCP certified, and I'm one of them. Would licensure somehow exclude certified on-the-job trained PAs? And then also some people are traveling PAs, and would that be a barrier for them, for these two groups? Can we talk about that?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So licensure can be established in a lot of different ways, and it's state by state. Every state's process is going to be a little bit different. The AAPA's Legislative Committee is currently working on all things licensure. And we try to be as involved as we can in the development and modification of licensure to ensure that the licensure laws and requirements are fair and inclusive without being too vague, because we want to make sure that we're capturing all of the certified PAs, but not necessarily including all of the other grossing personnel. And it can be a little bit of a tricky line to draw, but as long as the information is put together in an accurate way, which the committee has developed a specific set of standards that we are using when we reach out to different states as recommendations, which start out by stating the obvious pathway, which is the current one of attending a program and taking the exam. But we also always include that there was a previous pathway with on-the-job training that gave the opportunity to take the exam and become certified. So we always include pathway number 1 is the program's pathway number 2, on-the-job training with certification. And I think that's the key phrase at the end there, is that you didn't just have on-the-job training, you became certified. And so I feel like as long as that's included into the laws when the licensure is developed, then the on-the-job trained PAs should not be excluded. I do think that there's been a little bit of trouble with that in New York for some who, if they didn't attend a program, had some trouble getting a license there. But again, it just comes down to that development. So we're trying to work on some projects, and eventually we're going to pursue new licensure. So we're going to try to be very explicit in making sure that we're inclusive of all certified PAs.
As far as traveling PAs go, it would definitely have an effect on them, but it's a pretty nominal effect, to be honest. If a traveling PA does want to work in one of the states that has a license requirement, which is currently New York, Nevada, and West Virginia, they would have to apply for that license. Some traveling PAs focus their assignments regionally and could reasonably determine if a license in a certain state would be worth it for their interests. And also, some temporary placement agencies even cover the cost of this license. Also, a quick little plug here, I actually am starting my own travel staffing agency dedicated to medical lab professions. So this is a huge topic for me because I'm now getting into the business position of hiring my own PAs to go do more travel assignments that I'm not personally available for.
Okay.
And from the eyes of a staffing agency, I think it's better to have PAs that have a license and to have them working in states that have that requirement, because it does alleviate that HR work that you kind of touched on earlier, Jen, about how that license is just another layer of verification that helps solidify even further that the PA that I'm employing to go work in that state is all the more eligible to be there.
Gotcha.
So I personally think it's really great to have licensure, especially as a traveling PA.
Okay, I see. So for someone who's considering or is a traveling PA, do you think it's worthwhile to get the licensure in these 3 states ahead of time, even if you're
Oh, yeah.
not working there yet? Like just so you've got to take care of
Mhm.
before you do that?
Yeah. Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely. So New York, I when I first started as a PA, I worked full-time permanent in New York City.
Okay.
And so I got the New York license straight out of school because that became a requirement, I think the year I graduated from PA school. So, but I still was able to get it beforehand, before I even started there. So, and the process now I think has become even more streamlined. And I think back when I did it, I think it took like a couple months. But
Yeah.
nowadays, I think it takes maybe a month, maybe. I think usually only a couple weeks. And then for states like Nevada, that's the other state license that I have. That took literally 2 days, not even. And it
Wow.
was really just paying the state the money and giving them my proof of ASCP certification. And that was it. So, but I will touch on that a little bit in the fact that the eligibility requirements for the state license, we want to make sure that those requirements are stringent enough to only allow ASCP certified PAs to get that license. And that's
Yes.
actually one thing that us as the legislative subcommittee have been working on with the state of Nevada, is making those requirements a little more stringent for them, because as they stand right now, even people who are not ASCP certified can still get that Nevada license. So we are working on making sure that that is not the case going forward.
And just to touch on another sort of hesitation for traveling PAs as far as licensure goes. One of the big things is cost, right? So let's just say that your agency does not cover the cost for you. Some do, some don't. We did some research on other laboratory professionals like med techs. They're the most widely licensed lab profession. And the cost of the new license, from what we found, the average was only $80 to $90 for your initial application. And then depending on how often you had to renew, some were 1 year, some were 2 years, some were 3 years. But the annual renewal, if you average it out across per year basis, it only comes out to about $50. So it's not like we're talking about $1,000 application fee or anything crazy. So not that any amount of money, you don't want to spend it if you don't have to, but
Right.
we're talking about less than $100 per year for the license. So it's not terrible.
As we mentioned, right now only 3 states require licensure. And
Yes.
so it seems like the legislative subcommittee is going to start actively pursuing or help to actively pursue licensure in other states. Now, what are some steps that these states can take if they're considering licensure? And if we have AAPA members in those states, how can they get involved?
Definitely. Great question. So, as I just mentioned, the 3 states that do currently require state licensing are New York, Nevada, and West Virginia. And there are many additional states that license other medical lab professions, such as clinical lab scientists, med techs, histotechs, cytotechs, things like that. And if a state is considering adopting licensure of PAs, the best resource out there is definitely the AAPA, or the American Association of Pathologist Assistants. Our website has a ton of information on it, and it's all publicly available. Some of the information on that includes describing the role of PA, our educational backgrounds, the number and location of the PA programs, and gosh, yeah, there's just a ton of information on there. We also have a designated committee that helps with legislative efforts, the legislative subcommittee, as we've been talking about. And this subcommittee is made up of PAs who have a bunch of knowledge regarding the existing licensure laws. And we also have prepared packets that have information that can be sent to the legislatures of each state that have supporting documents like the official scope of practice, that we have our position statements, and even recommendations for how the requirements should be written. So the AAPA is a great resource for any of those state legislatures to work with in order to help build the proper requirements for state licensure if they're interested. And the legislative committee is also well prepared for any of the initiatives that are coming through. We're working to clean up existing licensure laws like the law in Nevada, as I mentioned earlier. And we're hoping to take actionable steps toward pursuing new licensure in the near future. AAPA members, as far as what they can do, there are actually a few different ways in how they can help. Number one, you can stay informed about the new legislation in your area that could impact laboratory personnel. If you just hear a rumor or even a little whisper of anything that might be going down in your state, please let the AAPA know. If you go to the website which is pathassist.org, there is contact information in there. You can send an email, phone call, whatever you want. Just let the AAPA know what's going on, and we can dedicate resources and time to investigating the issue or change that's coming. And if need be, we can then take action on any changes that may be coming. The number two way that they can help is join a committee if you have time. It's all volunteer based. There are a ton of different committees that we have, and each committee has different skill sets that are required and different time commitments as well. So you can do as little or as much as you want. And some things have lighter involvement, other things have more cyclical requirements. It all depends on what you have time for and what you want to pursue. And committee positions can also be upfront and center, doing things like this interview, or behind the scenes, just helping with documentation, things like that. And then the third way that AAPA members can help out is by participating in any surveys that are sent out by the AAPA. We create these surveys to establish needs, interests, and make decisions on whether to invest time and energy into certain projects or efforts based on responses from those surveys. The AAPA wants to know what you or us as the PA committee feels is most important and how we can help get the PA profession to where it needs and wants to be as a whole. And we can't complete any of these things without the help of volunteers. specifically from PAs.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, I've been a AAPA volunteer for a long time. I think 2007 or 8, something like that. But it
Wow.
is very rewarding. I've been involved with different committees, and it is very rewarding. And I would encourage, like you're saying, encourage any PA out there to get involved for sure. And it sounds like there's a lot of really good resources regarding licensure as well.
Definitely.
Yes.
Uh, one more resource that I want to talk about kind of at the end here. So Jen, you had an article come out in the Pathologist just recently about this topic, right? Can you talk
Yes,
about that?
absolutely. So we've actually published a couple of different things. So the most recent one is that the pathologist article that you saw. So the goal of that article in particular was to get information out there about the lack of regulation surrounding grossing, whether that's grossing biopsies or grossing complex. Really, the only regulation out there today is CLIA. And in those 3 states, New York, West Virginia, Nevada, that have a license. So the lack of regulation in this area to me was very concerning. And I know it's a passionate thing for many PAs. But like we were talking about earlier, this patient safety, every specimen has a patient attached. And if these PAs aren't regulated or grossing isn't regulated, it's just really terrifying to me what could potentially happen and how it could affect the patient outcome. So I really wanted to get that information out there, especially to pathologists. Like I said, when we found out about the fact that pathologists assumed we were already licensed, I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We got to make sure that they're aware of the lack of regulation because that's really, really important. And then we also have published in our organizational journal as well, the Cutting Edge, about this topic to drum up some interest and get people talking and keep it on everybody's mind, keep everyone engaged. We did a webinar on the AAPA website as well, going over what licensure is, why it's important, and things like that, which is actually available for continuing education credits if anyone wants to break up their dry case reports. But it's a very informative webinar there as well. So there's a lot of really good information and resources out there for AAPA members or even the general public. And so we're trying to hit all these different platforms and reach as many people as possible. Because the more we can get out there, the more visibility the profession gets, the more support we can get from fellow PAs and even pathologists. We can get some really good pathologist advocates in states that we start working with closely. It'll help to have supportive letters from them as we move forward in our process. And if anybody wants to contact AAPA about legislative things specifically, we do have our own email address, legislative@pathassist.org. Otherwise, people can also reach out to the general email, which is info@pathassist.org. Either way, questions will go where they need to go.
Yeah, I love it. A lot of great resources out there, and I'll include links to all of them in the show notes for this episode. This has been super interesting conversation. I've actually learned quite a bit from the both of you, and I hope that the audience has too, as far as why licensure is important for PAs and why now is the time to pursue it. So Jennifer Hudson, Ashley Olson, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
If you're looking for another episode of the People of Pathology podcast to check out after this one, here's a clip from my interview with Susan Stillman as we talk about the process of starting a brand new Pathologist Assistant program.
I was very excited because for me, this is putting together the best of both worlds. This is me being able to teach now full time but still love the world of pathologist assistants and what we do and be able to have that combination of teaching and also still being part of the pathologist assistant world, which is such a cool profession. So it was just perfect timing and a perfect combination. And I was like, yes, please, let's do it. People have been asking for a Wisconsin program. People have been reaching out to Carol saying, hey, we need this. Carol is well known for their graduate health programs. So we have, physical therapy, occupational therapy, athletic training, nursing. We have a lot of health programs. And this was something, and physician assistant too. This was something that people have reached out for and were asking to have one in Wisconsin. So it all just came together perfectly. At least I feel that way.
You can hear more from Susan Stillman in episode 168. Okay, big thanks to Ashley Olson and Jennifer Hudson. There was a lot of information in this episode, so let's recap. Jennifer and Ashley highlighted how the responsibilities of PAs have evolved over the years. With the ongoing shortage of pathologists, PAs are being relied on more than ever to perform critical, high-complexity tasks. And while ASCP certification proves we passed a rigorous national standard, licensure takes it one step further, ensuring that every individual practicing as a PA has had their credentials reviewed and verified by a state board. Licensure draws a distinct line between roles, between pathologist assistants and grossing techs, between certified professionals and those without appropriate training. It protects our title, defines our scope of practice, and prevents unqualified individuals from stepping into roles they haven't been trained for. But this isn't just about professional pride. It's about patient safety. We know that even a small error during the gross examination can lead to a misdiagnosis or delayed treatment. When licensed, PAs are more easily held to a high standard, and patients can trust that their specimens are being handled by someone with the training and experience to do it right. Now, there are understandable concerns. Will licensure hurt travel PAs? Will it leave behind those trained on the job? Jennifer and Ashley were honest about those questions. And the truth is, licensure can be implemented thoughtfully and inclusively. With the right planning and clearly defined tiers of practice, we can ensure no one is left behind while still protecting the integrity of the profession. And let's not forget the administrative and hiring benefits. Standard job titles, easier verification of credentials, and salary structures that finally reflect the advanced training PAs bring to the lab. And look, the point of this conversation was not to diminish the role of the grossing tech. They're important too. After all, that's how I got started. If anything, licensure for PAs might help to define the grossing tech position too, and they could benefit from this just as much as we do. If there's one takeaway today, it's this. Licensure is not a threat. It's an opportunity to advocate for ourselves, support each other, and provide the best care possible for the patients who rely on us. As mentioned in the interview, if you hear about licensure in your state, please contact the AAPA about it. And if you want to get involved, I'll have links in the show notes to all of the resources we talked about today. Don't forget you can follow the show at People of Path on Instagram and Twitter, or just connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you for continuing to share the show with others. Together, let's inspire the next generation of pathologists and laboratory professionals. This show is a member of Health Podcast Network. Thanks for listening. I'm Dennis Strank, and I'll talk to you next time on the People of Pathology podcast.